Okay, good morning, year 8. This is a bit of a strange sort of lesson, as I'm aware you're all at home. So I have done a recording of the lesson to help walk you through what we're going to be doing this morning. So I hope you're all well, and I hope you're all ready to learn. So what I need you to do is to turn to lesson number 4 in your booklet, which is what did colonialism look like in Australia? So lesson number 4, what did colonialism look like in Australia, okay? If you just pause the video now and you get yourself up to that lesson, I'll explain what we're going to be doing next. Okay, guys, so hopefully by now you've got to lesson number 4 and you'll see we have our 3 key definitions, which are convict, Aborigine, and New World. So I want you to really focus on understanding those words and have a good base for moving forward with this lesson. And you have the Quizlet there as well. Now, in terms of time for the Quizlet, it will, if you pause the video when I finish speaking and take as much time as you need, so it could be between 5 or sort of 8 minutes to complete the Quizlet, we will then go through that. So you have 2 definitions, a true or false, and how far did the British government control the empire task to do. So if you pause the video now and get started with that. Okay, so we'll go through the Quizlet now, guys. So, first one, so circle the correct definition of indigenous. So that is the first one. So people who are native or the original people who lived on a land, okay? And those are indigenous people. We often call them indigenous tribes, okay? But those are people who were there originally, who were there before the colonial settlers turned up. Okay, remember a colonial settler is someone who has migrated from an empire from another country and moved to another one, okay? The second one, true or false? The British Empire's only goal was to make money. Well, we know that is false. We know a big part of the empire was to make money, and that's a huge part of it. But we know there are other factors. So have a think about what other factors that we've looked at, okay, that was a big part of what the British Empire wanted to do. But we know a huge part of that was making money. Okay, and the third one, circle the correct definition for atrocity. Well, we know that that is an extremely wicked or a cruel act. So that's the first one, okay? And we looked at lots of atrocities that were happening last lesson in the Caribbean by the British, okay, particularly in regards to slave revolts. And the final one, number 4, that is very much down to your opinion of how much you think the government controlled the empire. And as we know, up until 1857, in India, they didn't control India. It was the East India Company. And we see that in lots of different examples where until that point, they didn't control parts of the empire and companies control it for them. But we know there was a switch. So ultimately, it's for you to decide how far. Okay, so this lesson, we're now focusing on Australia, okay, and colonialism there. So if you turn to the next, look below on your work booklet, you'll see we have the next task. And I want you to analyze the image to the right, that yellow and black clothing. I want you to analyze, I want you to write down 2 things you can see or circle them. And I want you to have a go at answering who might have worn that clothing. And also, if you find that too easy, sort of flying through it and you're smashing it, have a go at what can you infer about who migrated to Australia and why might they have migrated. So you are writing what you can see. You are thinking, who would have worn this clothing? And what can you infer about who migrated to Australia and why they might have done? So if you pause the video now, and I will go through it when you unpause it. Okay, fantastic. So here we have a really interesting image. I'm sure lots of you thought, oh, it's a uniform. Okay, that's definitely what we can see. We can see its sort of colors are very kind of vibrant. It's very loud as a piece of clothing. So I'm sure lots of you thought, well, that must be an army uniform. Or perhaps some of you said, oh, it could be a jester, someone who would have entertained in the medieval era. Actually, this was a uniform for a prisoner. So this was a prisoner's uniform because lots of people who migrated to Australia were prisoners. They were sent there as a sentence. Okay, so Australia is what we call, and be aware, I'm going to say quite a funny word now, and I need to be very mature. Australia was a penal colony. What that means is it was somewhere where people were sent as a penalty, as a punishment for crimes. Okay, so many people who migrated into early Australia were what we call convicts, people who were convicted of crimes. That relates to one of our key words. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a story now, all about Australia, okay, and its origins. And I just want you to sit and I just want you to listen, okay? I don't want you to do anything else. I just want you to sit and listen, and some stuff will come up on the PowerPoint. So the first thing is in 1770, you might have heard of him. We had Captain James Cook, okay? And he turns up in a place called Botany Bay, and or as he calls it, which is near modern day Sydney. And Captain James Cook arrives in Australia with his men, having just found it and discovered it. He plants a flag in there, in the middle of it, on land, and claims it as land for the king. And he says, "This land is now for the king," and slams down his flag into the land in Australia. Now, there is only one problem with that. Australia was already inhabited by a group of people. And for 40,000 years, historians think, the Aboriginal people, the Aborigines, as you may have heard them called, they lived in Australia at that time. And they had already sort of developed their culture and their society, if you like, in Australia. And they had been there for a very, very long time. And there are roughly about 2 million of them. But Britain was sort of very concentrated on getting this colony. So what they do from 1778, they create what I said before, a penal colony. So that is a prison colony in Botany Bay, which is now Sydney. And 11 ships arrived carrying 800 prisoners. So that is a huge amount of people who were put there. And they were sent to Australia not to be put behind bars and a traditional prison, but they were sent there to create roads or work on farms, do very hard work that could help the empire make money. So they could do the work that was required for making money in Australia, because there were lots of things in Australia that were very desirable for the British government, such as natural resources, and a huge amount of gold that was found as well. Now, at the end of their sentence, because some people were only sentenced to a couple of years of this kind of hard labor, and these prisoners were kind of given their freedom, and lots of them decided to stake claim, so claim that part of the land was theirs, because there was lots of land in Australia. Australia is huge. As a continent, it's sort of a mini continent, almost the size of Europe. Is massive. So lots of people are like, well, I'm living here now. I'm going to claim this land. So lots of ex-convicts would claim land and head out to the frontier, which is unclaimed pieces of land on the edges of the colonies that have been set up. And lots of it is now, as we know, the outback in Australia, which is this kind of big, unsort of inhabited area of wildlife. Okay. And this land was originally lived in by the Aborigines. So this creates tension between the Aborigines and the new white settlers. Now, the white settlers were often armed. They would have guns. They would have modern technology. However, the Aborigines have been living there for thousands of years, have not developed that technology yet. So they still fought with spears, with arrows, and very sort of traditional weapons that the white settlers had stopped using hundreds, if not thousands, of years before. And often this would lead to tension between Aborigines and the white settlers, and it would lead to war. And there was lots of fighting, and many Aborigines were killed in this fighting by the white settlers, purely because the white settlers had weapons that would do far more damage. And in 1830, on an island just off the coast of Australia called Tasmania, you might have heard of Tasmania because of the Tasmanian Devil, which was a cartoon, or many of you might not have watched that. However, they've tried to force Aborigines out of Tasmania. and created the Black Line, which was a sort of an area where the Aborigines were forced into, and many of them were killed. And by 1920, it's estimated that there were only 100,000 Aboriginal people living in Australia. Now, in 1770, it's estimated there was between 1 and 2 million of these Aboriginal people. So this was a huge, huge massacre, really, of culture, of these tribes. And the Aborigines were all but kind of wiped out by 1920. So we can see the impact of the British, the white settlers, okay? And also the Dutch wanted to have a claim there, but also they brought over things like colds and illnesses that we might think of, oh, that's not that bad. But to someone who's never had these illnesses before, their DNA isn't used to it, it would have been near enough disastrous. So having listened to that story now, and in your workbook on your next page, you'll see lots of that information is in a yellow box. I want you to just have a think about what we've just talked about. Maybe you need to pause the video and reread some of that text about what has happened in Australia as a colony. And I want you to just tick off the different boxes we have to see what you can see so far, okay? And I just want you to tick them off and say, well, actually, Sir's talked about this. I'm going to tick that off, okay? And remember that each one of these things is really important to the empire. So if you just pause the video now, and we will go through it in a minute. Okay, so when we look there, have we seen control from Britain? Well, yeah, we have. So we can tick that off because we've seen Britain sending prisoners to this penal colony in Australia, in Sydney. Have we seen military power? Well, yeah, we have seen a bit of military power because they've brought their weapons over the white settlers and they've been wiping out the Aborigines. Have we seen migration? Yes, we have definitely seen migration. We have seen people migrating to Australia. Have we seen a civilizing mission? Are they making life better for those Aboriginal people? Well, no, they're not. Have we seen a rivalry with European nations? Well, not really. No one else is really that interested. Finally, have we seen making profit, making money from Australia? Well, we've seen a bit of that because that is why the prisoners went there, to farm, to work on infrastructure such as roads, to help make money from this colony, and later would go and mine gold. So we're going to move on to the next section. So if we turn our page over, you should have your timeline there. And again, we've got a big timeline of what's happened in Australia from 40,000 BC when the Aboriginal tribes arrive in Australia, right up until 1920 when we only have 100,000 Aboriginal people left. So what I want you to do now, you're going to circle at least two boxes that show us about migration, about people moving to Australia. You're going to draw a box around any of these events that you see are relating to Aboriginal people, the indigenous people of Australia, the Aborigines, okay? You are then going to draw a star next to any box where we can see the military involved. And we'll go through some of these together at the end. You also have a challenge there to have a go at to see how similar was the empire in Australia to the empire in India. It's quite a big, broad question. So I want you to have a go at that now. So if you pause the video and have a go at those tasks. Okay, guys. So hopefully you've worked through that. As you can see, there are lots linked to migration. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through two for each one. And then you will have the time kind of to make any corrections or add anything further. So straight away, we can say migration, 1778, Britain creates a prison colony. I draw a circle around that. Nice and easy, that one, okay? And I'm going to do 1850 is the gold rush, where thousands migrate to Australia from the empire in search of gold. I'm going to draw a circle around that because that is people moving to Australia to help it work or for their benefit. Now, in terms of indigenous people, I'm going to put a box around 40,000 BC with the Aboriginal people, and I'm going to put a box around 1920 with the only 100,000 Aboriginal people being left in Australia. So I'm putting boxes around those two because they tell us about the Indigenous population. Finally, I'm going to draw a star next to the following ones that relate to military. I'm going to put one next to 1914 to 1918, so World War I, where the Australian nationals, 500,000, 500,000 of them fought in the First World War, which was incredible. Their service was very much needed. And I'm going to put a star by the black line, okay, which is to do with forcing the Australians away from Tasmania. Okay. So take any time you need to have another reread of that and make sure you're happy with the story of Australia. So if you pause the video now. Okay, guys, so we're going to move on to our next section. And again, we're going to be looking at some stories, except it's going to look slightly different this time. This time, I've given you what we call a living graph, which is a graph over time. And the graph shows us +5 to -5. And I'm going to go through that. But the first thing I want you to do is along the bottom, I want you to write all of those dates along the bottom so we have a clear idea of our timeline. So we still have that idea of chronology. So if you write those down, so pause the video and write those down now for me. Okay, so hopefully you've got those down, which is great. We're now going to look at what this living graph is. So you'll see it says along the side, we have all those numbers. At the top of it, it says 5, and we have violence by that. That would mean anything that is really violent, where we see any kind of brutal treatment, any military there, we'd put that as a 5. At the bottom, we have -5, where we have the civilizing mission. So anything that is very peaceful, that is making people's lives in Australia better, so making their lives better, we'd put -5K. And that is to do with all of the different ones we have. Anything, your scale should go in between. So very violent acts go at the top, or very bad acts for people's lives at the top. Very sort of good acts for people's lives, where they're making things better, would go further towards the bottom. So it's on a scale of +5 to -5K. 0 would be, well, it's not really either of those things. So I'm going to put it in the middle. So it's not good nor bad, okay? So we're going to look again at our stories. So you need to go into Microsoft Teams, and I've put all the stories in there along with this lesson. So you need to make sure you've got those there. So make sure you've got those in front of you, okay? And it was a Word document. So if you just pause the video and make sure you've got your stories ready and come back to the video. Okay, so hopefully you've got your stories now. I'm going to go through one with you to start with, and then you're going to have time to go and work through as many of these stories as possible. And I'm going to give you about 15 minutes to do that. So, okay, here we go. So we've got our first one, and I'll read it to you. So December 1790. So we know it's going to go on this column, 1790. It's going to go over here. So the British settlers believed that they should react aggressively to any attacks from Aborigine tribes. In December 1790, a group of settlers left Sydney and entered Aboriginal lands to go hunting. Early in the morning, they were attacked by Aborigine warriors, and a convict called McIntyre, known as the governor's gamekeeper, was speared in the chest. The governor of Sydney sent a group of soldiers led by Lieutenant Watkin Tench, an army officer, a leader. Tench was ordered to capture 6 members of the Aboriginal tribe, hang 2 by their necks until they died, and send the rest to Norfolk Island to prison. If he could not capture any men, he was ordered to shoot 6 and could decapitate them, to take their heads off. So this is a pretty shocking story, and we can definitely say, well, this is very violent. So I'm going to go to my column for 1790, and I'm going to put it at around a 5, I would say. So I'm going to write Lieutenant Watkin Tench captures men and kills 6, at least 6, and decapitates them, okay? Something like that, okay, to sort of summarize that story about why it's so bad, okay? So that's what I want you to be doing. I want you to be spending about the next 15 minutes going through this and having a go at adding as many different stories from all of the stories I've given you to your living graph. Okay, remember to look at the date and to make sure you use that as for the columns going up. And then you need to decide, well, was it violent or did it make their lives better? Okay, so if we just pause the video there and you start to work through that for me. Okay, so hopefully you've got a really good spread of stories, okay? Year 8, because I'm sure you have done lots of that and you've got as many there as possible onto your living graph. We're now going to move on and have a look at our final thing. So again, we're coming back to our hexagon and using all of our different factors in empire, and we're going to be doing some shading again. So what I want you to do is anywhere where we've not seen any story, for example, we've not seen anything about rivalry with European nations, we can get rid of that. We don't need that. So I want you to just cross it out. You're then going to decide, well, what was the most important thing to make Australia work? What was important in Australia? For example, you might say, well, control from Britain was quite important. So I'm going to put that as a 4, okay, or a 5, something like that in the middle, because it's quite important. And I want you to shade in all of that. I then want you to say, what do you think is the most important factor? For example, you might say, well, actually, migration is the most important factor. And I'm going to explain this by saying this is because it was the most important thing in making Australia work, okay? Because without migration, Australia doesn't work. And you're going to give an explanation that is better than the one I've just given you about why one of your factors is the most important. So again, what you're doing is you're shading in your hexagon and you're writing which is the most important factor and then having her explaining. And again, only spend about 5 minutes doing this. So I want you to pause the video and spend 5 minutes doing that. Okay, guys. So hopefully you've completed that and you found it really good. That is the end of our lesson today. Hopefully you found it easy enough and you've been able to work through all of that. I'm looking forward to seeing you all next week. I'm very much looking forward to having us all back in the classroom together. Hope you stay safe and you have a really good rest of your week and a good weekend. Thank you very much, guys.